Good evening and welcome back. The hour has grown still, and the room around you has begun the slow practice of letting go of the day. The lamps are low, the corners have softened. Whatever the morning brought, whatever the afternoon asked, whatever the evening still holds in its small, busy hands, you may begin now, little by little, to set it down. There is no urgency here. The story we are about to enter is older than urgency. It has waited a long time already. It will wait, patient as a sun-warmed stone, for as much of your attention as you can give before sleep takes you. Let your shoulders settle. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands lie wherever they have come to rest, open or folded, whichever feels more natural to the body that has carried you this far. There is no pose to maintain tonight. There is no question to answer before the morning. The day, with all its rough edges, may now begin its slow folding away into memory, and the night, kind and old, may begin to gather you up. Tonight, we enter the story of Apollo, the bright son of Zeus and Leto, the twin brother of Artemis, the god of light and music and prophecy and healing, the lord of the lyre and the bow, the patron of the great oracle at Delphi, and the master of the 9 muses. He is one of the most luminous of the Olympian gods, the figure the Greeks turn to for clarity in a confused world, for music in a silent one, for prophecy in a moment of difficult decision. His story is full of bright detail and quiet sorrow together, of laurel trees and laurel crowns, of dolphins and ravens, of a serpent at the foot of a mountain and a tripod above a chasm, of lovers lost and friendships ended too soon. We will move through these images slowly. We will not press them. We will let them rise and fade like figures painted faintly on the wall of an old temple. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. You may close your eyes if your eyes wish to close. The story will keep its shape without you watching it. The Greeks who first told it would have understood. They told their stories often around fires in the dark hours when the work of the day had ended, and the bodies of the listeners had begun their own quiet slumber. The teller continued. The listener slept, or did not sleep, as the listener wished. The story carried on regardless, and it kept its dignity, because the teller knew that dignity does not require an audience that is always awake. In the beginning of this telling, we must step back, before Apollo was born, into the older household of Olympus, where Zeus had recently become king and had recently taken Hera as his queen. The Titanomachy had ended. The new gods were settling into their household. Athena had already been born from her father's head. The cosmos was finding its new shape. And Zeus, as the old singers tell, had begun the long pattern of his loves outside the marriage with Hera, the pattern that would shape so many of the later stories of his children. One of those loves was Leto, the daughter of 2 of the great titans, Koios and Phoebe. Leto was gentle. The old poets describe her as soft-spoken, generous, with eyes the colour of the early evening sky. She was not as old as Metis, not as fierce as Themis, not as proud as her sister Asteria. She was, in her quiet way, one of the kindest figures of the older generation. Zeus loved her. Leto, in turn, loved Zeus. Their love was, in the old tradition, a tender one. It produced 2 children, Artemis, the elder by a little, and Apollo, the younger. But Hera, who watched her husband's loves with the fierce attention of a queen guarding her dignity, was not pleased. She was particularly displeased with this one because she had heard a prophecy that Leto's children would be among the most luminous of the new gods, more luminous perhaps than her own children, Ares and Hebe. The thought of being outshone by the children of another woman in her own household was more than Hera could bear. So she set herself against Leto. She forbade any solid ground anywhere in the world from receiving Leto in her labor. The land itself, fearing Hera's anger, drew back from Leto wherever she went. Imagine then the pregnant Leto wandering from place to place, seeking a piece of earth that would let her give birth. She went to mainland Greece. The mainland refused her. She went to the islands of the Aegean. The islands refused her. She went to the coasts of Asia Minor. The coasts refused her. She went, finally, to the far places, the rocky outposts where almost no one lived, and even those drew back when she approached. Her body grew heavier. Her time grew nearer. She wept sometimes, the old singers say, with the slow tears of a woman who has been driven from every hearth she has tried to approach. In her wandering, she came at last to a small island called Delos. Delos was a strange place. It was a wandering island in some traditions, an island that floated freely on the surface of the sea, attached to no fixed point on the bottom. Because it was not anchored, the prohibition against receiving Leto did not quite apply to it. Earth had forbidden solid ground from receiving the goddess. Delos was not exactly solid ground. It was a piece of land that had no anchored place. It could receive Leto without violating the prohibition. Delos hesitated, the old story says, when Leto approached. The little island was poor. It had no great forests, no famous shrines, no important harbours. It was a small rocky place with a few palm trees and a small pool. It feared that hosting the labour of so important a goddess would only bring it Hera's anger and ruin. But Leto promised that her children, once born, would honour Delos forever. The small wandering island, after some thought, agreed. Leto came ashore. She lay down beneath a palm tree at the edge of the small pool. Her labour began. It was long, the old tradition says, because Hera had also detained Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, on Olympus, refusing to let her descend to assist. Without Eileithyia, no birth could be completed easily. Leto laboured for 9 days and 9 nights. The other goddesses watched in distress. They sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, to bribe Eileithyia with a magnificent necklace, 9 cubits long, made of amber and gold. Eileithyia, persuaded by the gift and perhaps also by her own pity for the labouring mother, slipped away from Hera and came to Delos. Then Leto gave birth. First came Artemis, the elder twin. The old tradition says that Artemis, born first and able to stand almost at once, served as midwife for her own brother's birth. The image is strange and lovely. A newly born goddess, still wet from her own emergence, kneeling to help her brother come into the world. The Greeks loved this small detail. It made Artemis, from her first breath, the goddess of mothers and of childbirth, a role she would carry in many local traditions thereafter. Then came Apollo. The old singers say that when he was born, swans circled the island 7 times. The palm tree on Delos bent slightly toward the newborn. A small wind moved across the pool. The whole island, which had been poor and forgotten, suddenly felt rich. Leto rested. The twins lay in the small shelter their mother and Eileithyia had made. Above, in the clear Aegean sky, the day began to brighten. Delos itself, the old tradition continues, was fastened in place from that moment on. The 4 pillars of the world were planted around it, and it became one of the fixed points of the Mediterranean, a sacred island honoured by the Greeks for centuries to come as the birthplace of the bright twins. The little wandering island had become the center of a particular sacred geography. Pilgrims came to it from across the Greek world. Its small palm tree was preserved with great care for generations. Even when no one lived there permanently, the sanctuaries on Delos were kept clean and functional, the lamps lit, the offerings received. Apollo grew quickly, as gods often do in the old stories. His first food, the old tradition says, was nectar and ambrosia given to him by Themis, the upright Titan who had sided with the new gods. With each sip, Apollo grew. By the time he had been fed for a few days, he was already a young man, his shoulders broad, his eyes bright, his voice clear. He picked up a bow, the old story says, and tested the bowstring against his finger. He picked up a lyre and ran his thumb across the strings. He was ready, in the manner of mythic children, almost immediately for the work he had been born to do. What was that work? Apollo was, as the Greeks understood him, several things at once. He was the god of light, particularly the bright, clarifying light of the sun. Though the sun itself was associated with the older Titan Helios, he was the god of music, the master of the lyre, the leader of the muses. He was the god of prophecy, the keeper of the great oracle at Delphi. He was the god of healing, the father of Asclepius, the patron of the long human art of medicine. He was the god of archery, the bowman whose arrows brought either swift, just death or sudden plague. He was the god of poetry, the source of the inspiration that the Greeks called the gift of the muses. He was, in some local traditions, the god of shepherds and of flocks, the keeper of the long, quiet, pastoral life. All these aspects gathered around the single bright figure of Apollo. He was, more than any other Olympian, the god of multiple bright domains all at once. Athena had her wisdom, Artemis had her hunt, Aphrodite had her love. Apollo had everything that the bright, clear light of the world could touch. The Greeks did not always know what to do with so much brightness in a single figure. They sometimes split him into local aspects, with different cities honoring different sides of him. Apollo the healer at Epidaurus, Apollo the musician at Delos, Apollo the prophet at Delphi, Apollo the herdsman in the small mountain shrines. But they always understood that these aspects belonged to one god, and that the clarity of his presence was the thread that joined them. The list of his domains is full, and the events of his life will multiply, but you do not need to hold them all. You may keep one image: the palm tree on Delos, the swans circling, the young god with his lyre and his bow, the 7 days of music as Themis fed him with nectar. Any one of these is enough to carry the shape of the story forward. The first great deed of Apollo's youth was the killing of Python, the great serpent of Delphi. Delphi in the old geography was a place on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece, where a deep chasm in the rock breathed out a strange vapor that affected those who breathed it. It had been a sacred place long before Apollo. It had been the seat of Themis in some traditions, and before her of her mother Phoebe, and before her of the great Earth Mother Gaia herself. Delphi was an old place. It had been a place of oracle for many generations before the new gods, and Python guarded it. Python was a great serpent, the child of Gaia, the dragon who coiled around the omphalos, the stone that the Greeks believed marked the center of the world. Python was not malevolent in every tradition. He was sometimes simply the guardian, the keeper of the place, the old form of the spirit who watched over the chasm and its vapor. But in many tellings, Python was hostile to Leto and her children. He had been sent by Hera, in some versions, to pursue Leto during her labour. He had not caught her, but he remained, an ancient threat coiled around the navel of the world, a danger to the new bright god who would one day claim the oracle. Apollo went to Delphi. He was young still, only days or weeks past his birth. He carried a great bow that had been made for him in some traditions by Hephaestus, in others by his own divine craft. He approached the chasm. Python rose to meet him. The fight was not long in the old tradition. The bright young god, with his sure aim and his swift movement, was more than the ancient serpent could match. Apollo loosed arrow after arrow. Python recoiled, struck, recoiled again. The blood of the serpent fell on the rocks of Parnassus. The serpent finally died, coiled around the omphalos, its great body softening into the limestone slope. We will pass this moment gently. The sleep story does not need its sharp metals. We will only mark that Apollo, in killing Python, took the oracle of Delphi for himself. From that day on, Delphi was his place. The chasm was his chasm. The vapor that rose from the chasm became the source of his oracular speech. The omphalos, the stone marking the center of the world, became his sacred stone. And pilgrims for the next 1,000 years would come to Delphi to consult Apollo's oracle, breathing the same vapor that had once belonged to Python. But the killing was not without its cost. Apollo had shed the blood of an ancient being, a child of the earth herself, and the old laws of the cosmos required that such a deed be cleansed before he could properly take his place. So, Apollo went into exile. He went, the tradition says, to the valley of Tempe in northern Greece, where he spent a long time, perhaps 9 years, in one tradition, performing the slow rituals of purification. He bathed in the streams, he fasted. He cut a branch of laurel from the trees of Tempe and made of it the laurel crown that would become his sacred plant. When his purification was complete, he returned to Delphi, this time as the cleansed lord of the oracle, ready to begin his long work as the speaker of bright clarities. The Delphic oracle was one of the most important religious institutions of the ancient Greek world. For more than 1,000 years, pilgrims came to consult it. They came from cities all over the Mediterranean. They came with questions of war and peace, of marriage and burial, of plague and prosperity. They climbed the long zigzag path up the steep slope to the small precinct where the oracle stood. They paid the priests their offerings. They were purified at the sacred spring of Castalia. They entered the small inner chamber of the temple, where the omphalos stood and where the chasm breathed. The oracle herself was a woman called the Pythia, named for the dead serpent over which she now presided. She sat on a 3-legged tripod above the chasm. She breathed the vapor. She entered a trance state. She spoke, often in disconnected phrases that the priests then interpreted into formal verse and delivered to the pilgrim. The phrases were not always clear. The old Greeks said that Apollo never lied, but he also never said anything simply. His prophecies were riddles. They required listening. They required interpretation. They sometimes required the pilgrim to live for many years before understanding what had been said. The most famous example of this kind of riddling truth is the prophecy delivered to King Croesus of Lydia, who came to Delphi to ask whether he should make war against the Persian king Cyrus. The oracle told him that if he made the war, he would destroy a great kingdom. Croesus, hearing this, was reassured. He made the war. The great kingdom he destroyed turned out to be his own. The oracle had not lied. Croesus had not listened carefully enough. This was Apollo's particular kind of truth. He did not give comfortable answers. He gave true ones, in language that the listener had to work to understand. The Greeks honored this quality. They knew that the truth, when it arrived, often arrived in shapes that did not flatter the questioner. The pilgrim who came to Delphi was not coming for reassurance. They were coming for the harder gift of clarity, however that clarity arrived. There were many other famous prophecies given at Delphi over the centuries. The Spartan kings consulted the oracle before their wars. The Athenians consulted it before great civic decisions. The Romans in later periods sent their own embassies. Even rulers far beyond the Greek world, in the kingdoms of Lydia and Phrygia and the cities of Italy, sent emissaries to climb the mountain and to hear what Apollo would say. The prestige of the oracle was such that no question of great moment in the ancient Mediterranean world felt complete until the god at Parnassus had been consulted. The priests who served the oracle were as important in their own way as the Pythia herself. They were the interpreters. They worked the trance speech of the Pythia into the verse forms that pilgrims received. They knew the political situations of the cities that sent embassies. They knew, with the diplomatic instincts of long-serving advisors, how to phrase Apollo's answers in ways that would be useful without committing the god to anything too specific. The oracle was, in some sense, a long-running institution staffed by careful, intelligent men and women who took their work seriously and who shaped the Greek political world for 1,000 years through their interpretations. Apollo's lyre is another of his great signs. The lyre, that small stringed instrument played by plucking, became the instrument of song and poetry for the Greeks. Apollo had received his lyre in the old tradition from his half-brother Hermes. Hermes, on the very day of his birth, had stolen the cattle of Apollo, hidden them carefully, and then made the first lyre by stretching strings across the shell of a tortoise. When Apollo, furious, came to confront the newborn god, Hermes charmed him by playing the lyre. Apollo, hearing the music for the first time, forgot his anger. He accepted the lyre as compensation for the stolen cattle. From that day, Apollo became the lord of the lyre and Hermes the lord of the herald's staff and of swift messages. Apollo's music was, in the Greek imagination, the music of order, of harmony, of the soul brought into balance. He led the 9 muses, the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, who were the goddesses of the arts, Calliope of epic poetry, Clio of history, Erato of lyric love poetry, Euterpe of music, Melpomene of tragedy, Polyhymnia of sacred hymn, Terpsichore of dance, Thalia of comedy, and Urania of astronomy. The muses sang at the gatherings of the gods. Apollo with his lyre led their singing. Together they were the divine source of the long human inheritance of art and culture. The Greeks loved this image of the muses around their leader. They imagined the sound of 9 voices and a lyre as the sound of perfect harmony, the music that the cosmos itself made when it was working as it should. The orderly relations of the planets, the orderly relations of the seasons, the orderly relations of human society at its best. All of these were, in the Greek imagination, kinds of music that Apollo and his muses presided over. This is part of why he was called the god of harmony, in a sense larger than musical harmony alone. He was the god of things being in their right relations, the body in healthy balance, the mind in clear thought, the community in peaceful order, the soul in the right relation to itself. All these forms of right relation were Apollo's. To be out of harmony with any of them was to be out of harmony with him, and the old Greeks believed that this kind of disharmony could be cured by music, by purification, by listening to the oracle, by the slow, patient practices that brought the soul back into its right shape. There is, in the figure of Apollo as the leader of the Muses, an old Greek thought about the relationship between work and inspiration. The Muses, in the old tradition, did not simply hand poetry to the poet. They visited those who had prepared themselves by long study, by discipline, by careful attention to the techniques of their art. The poet who had not learned his craft would not be visited. The musician who had not practiced her scales would not be inspired. Inspiration came, but it came to those who had made themselves ready to receive it. Apollo, as the leader of the Muses, was the god of this kind of inspired discipline. He honored the work that preceded the gift. The Greeks honored many small forms of this preparation. The poet would purify himself before composing. The musician would tune her instrument with care. The sculptor would prepare his stone with the proper invocations. The historian would walk the ground where the events had happened. None of these preparations guaranteed that the Muses would visit, but all of them honored the relationship between human effort and divine gift. Apollo presided over this relationship. He was the god of those who worked hard and waited patiently for the moment when the work was joined by something beyond the work. But Apollo's life was not only triumphs. The old myths give him his sorrows as well, and tonight we will speak of 3 of them quietly. The first is the story of Daphne. Daphne was a nymph, the daughter of the river god Peneus. She was beautiful, with long hair and bright eyes, but she had vowed to remain unmarried, to follow the path of Artemis rather than of Aphrodite, to spend her life in the forests and the streams rather than in the houses of any husband. Apollo saw her, and Apollo loved her. The old story tells of how Apollo's love came to him. He had, in some traditions, mocked the small love god Eros, telling him that the bow was not for children. Eros, offended, shot 2 arrows. The golden arrow that causes love struck Apollo. The leaden arrow that causes the rejection of love struck Daphne. From that moment, Apollo loved Daphne, and Daphne fled from Apollo. He chased her through the forests. She ran. She was swift, but he was swifter. As she felt him gaining on her, she cried out to her father Peneus, the river god, for help. Peneus, hearing his daughter's plea, transformed her. As Apollo reached out to touch her shoulder, her skin became bark. Her hair became leaves, her arms became branches, her feet became roots. She had become a laurel tree. Apollo stopped, his hand on the bark that had been her shoulder. The story says he wept. He could not have her now, but he made a vow. The laurel would be his sacred plant forever. The crowns of victors would be made of laurel. The crowns of poets would be made of laurel. The branches of laurel would be hung over the doors of his temples. Wherever the laurel grew, he would honor the memory of Daphne, the nymph who had become a tree rather than be taken by a god she did not love. It is a strange and difficult story, and the old singers told it with care. It honors the laurel. It also honors the freedom of Daphne, who chose transformation over surrender. Apollo, for all his brightness, did not get what he wanted. The god of clarities had to accept the clarity of a refusal. The laurel he wore from that day forward was, in some sense, a memorial to his own loss. The second story is the story of Hyacinthus. Hyacinthus was a young Spartan prince, beautiful, athletic, beloved by Apollo. The god and the boy were close companions. They played together at the throwing of the discus, that round, flat stone that Greek athletes hurled in their competitions. One day, the old tradition says, they were practicing the discus together. Apollo threw. The discus, perhaps caught by an ill wind, sent by the jealous Zephyrus, the west wind, who also loved Hyacinthus, struck the boy on the head as he ran to retrieve it. Hyacinthus fell. Apollo in panic tried to save him. He tried his healing arts. They were not enough. Hyacinthus died in Apollo's arms. The god of healing, who could cure so many other ills, could not save his beloved companion. From the blood of Hyacinthus, the old story says, sprang the flower called the hyacinth, the small, bright purple flower that bloomed each spring on the hillsides of Greece. Apollo, in his grief, made the flower sacred. He kept the boy's name attached to it. The hyacinth in the old Greek calendar bloomed at the time of a small spring festival called the Hyacinthia, held at Sparta in honor of the dead prince. The festival lasted 3 days. The first day was mourning. The second day was celebration of the boy's memory. The third day was the celebration of his transformation into the bright flower. The third story is the story of Cyparissus, a young boy of the island of Caia, who was beloved by Apollo. Cyparissus had a tame stag, a magnificent animal with golden antlers that he loved more than any other companion. One day, by accident, Cyparissus killed the stag with a hunting javelin he had not seen the stag step into. His grief was so great that he prayed to be allowed to mourn forever. Apollo, hearing the prayer, transformed Cyparissus into the cypress tree, the tall, dark tree that was associated with mourning in the Greek world. From that day, the cypress was planted in graveyards. To pass a row of cypresses in the Greek landscape was, in the old imagination, to walk past the long mourning of a boy and a god who had loved each other and who had been parted by accident. 3 stories of loss, 3 living memorials: the laurel, the hyacinth, and the cypress. The Greeks who walked among these plants in their gardens and on their hillsides walked among the small, slow griefs of the bright god, kept in the leaves and the petals. The plants themselves were a kind of map of Apollo's heart, marked on the landscape, available to any walker who would look. The Greeks did not always remember the stories behind these plants, but they grew up among them. They saw the laurel at every victor's brow. They picked the hyacinths in spring. They planted the cypresses at the tombs of their dead. The shape of Apollo's sorrows became part of the texture of their ordinary lives. These 2 stories, Daphne and Hyacinthus and Cyparissus, give Apollo his shadow. He was not only the bright god, he was also the god who lost what he loved, who chased what would not stay, who held the dying in his arms and could not heal them. The laurel and the hyacinth and the cypress, the tree and the flower and the tree were the small living memorials of his griefs, growing on every Greek hillside, reminding the listener that even the bright god had known what it was to lose. Apollo also had a son, Asclepius, who became the greatest of the human healers and eventually a god of healing in his own right. Asclepius was the son of Apollo and Coronis, a mortal woman of Thessaly. The story of his birth is one of the difficult ones in the old myth. Coronis had been unfaithful to Apollo in some traditions. Apollo, learning of this, struck her down. But as she was burning on her funeral pyre, Apollo took the unborn child from her body and gave him to the wise centaur Chiron to raise. Chiron taught Asclepius the arts of medicine. Asclepius grew to surpass his teacher. He became famous for his skill at healing. He could even, in some traditions, bring the dead back to life. This last skill brought him into conflict with Hades, who complained to Zeus that the underworld was losing its just share of the dead. Zeus, agreeing with Hades, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. Apollo, in grief and rage at the killing of his son, retaliated by killing the Cyclopes, the ones who made the thunderbolts. For this, Apollo was punished by Zeus. He was sent into exile, this time to serve as a herdsman to a mortal king named Admetus of Thessaly for a year and a day. Apollo, the bright god of Delphi, the master of the lyre and the bow, spent a year as a shepherd in the household of Admetus. He kept the cattle. He played his lyre by the fires at evening. He was kind to his mortal employer. When his service was done, he made sure that Admetus's herds prospered in his absence. He left behind, the old tradition says, a memory of a particularly bright and musical young shepherd whom the household never quite forgot. After Apollo's exile, Asclepius was, in some traditions, eventually restored. He was made a god, raised to the heavens as a constellation, with the snake-coiled staff that became the medical sign across many later centuries. His shrines became major centers of healing in the ancient world. The most famous of them, at Epidaurus, was a sanctuary where the sick came to sleep in the temple, hoping to be visited by Asclepius or one of his sacred snakes in a healing dream. The shrine had a theatre, a stadium, baths, dormitories and gardens. It was a kind of ancient healing resort where the body and the soul together were tended for many days. The traditions of the shrines of Asclepius shaped many later ideas of medicine, including some that survive in modern medical symbols. The healing arts of Apollo and his son were not only the arts of curing the body, they were also the arts of curing the soul. The Greeks understood that many illnesses had no purely physical cause. A grief unspoken could become a fever. A guilt uncleansed could become a wasting illness. The shrines of Apollo and Asclepius were places where these soul illnesses too were treated. Pilgrims would tell their dreams, priests would interpret them, purification rituals would be performed, music would be played. The patient would gradually feel the unspoken parts of themselves coming into the light, into the careful attention of the god of clarity, and would feel, day by day, the lifting of the weight they had been carrying without knowing. This was one of the gentlest aspects of Apollo. He was the god who watched the unseen places of the soul. He saw what the patient could not yet see. He helped the patient see it slowly, at the speed they could bear. The shrines of healing were places of long stays, not of quick cures. A patient might remain for weeks. The cure, when it came as a gradual recognition rather than a sudden event. This was Apollo's way. He did not heal by force. He healed by clarity. Apollo was also the god of the Hyperboreans, the people who lived in the old Greek imagination in the far north, beyond the cold mountains, in a land of perpetual spring. The Hyperboreans were Apollo's particular people. They worshipped him at temples built of swans' feathers. They sent offerings of grain, wrapped in straw, that travelled from one Greek shrine to another by hand until they finally reached Delos, the god's birthplace. Apollo himself, the old tradition said, spent the winter months among the Hyperboreans, leaving Delphi quiet during those months when the oracle was less active. He returned in the spring, riding in a chariot drawn by swans, bringing with him the warmer light that broke the cold of winter. This pattern of Apollo's annual departure and return was honoured in the Delphic calendar. The winter months were the months when Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, presided over the sanctuary in Apollo's absence. The summer months were when Apollo returned and the great festivals were held. The Greeks, who liked their cosmos to be ordered, found in this annual rhythm of departure and return a satisfying pattern. Even the bright god needed his rest. Even the great oracle needed its quieter months. The image of Apollo travelling north each winter, returning south each spring, became a way for the Greeks to understand the rhythm of the year itself. The cold months were when the bright god was away. The warm months were when he had returned. The first leaves of spring were the small signs that he was coming. The bare branches of late autumn were the small signs that he was leaving. The seasons were not merely weather, they were the breathing of the god, and the breathing of the god was the breathing of the world. Good evening, and welcome back, if your mind has wandered through the long middle of the story. The figures have gathered. The wandering Leto, the palm tree on Delos, the swans, the great serpent Python, the omphalos, the laurel of Daphne, the hyacinth of the dying prince, the cypress of Xyparissus, the dying Asclepius, and the cyclops Apollo, killed in his grief, the Hyperboreans in their far green country. You do not need to hold them all, you may keep one, the palm tree, the omphalos, the laurel. Any one of these is the door into Apollo's story, and any one is enough for tonight. Apollo's role in the larger arc of Greek myth was often to be the god of bright clarity in moments when clarity was needed. The Iliad, that great old poem of the Trojan War, opens with Apollo's anger. The Greek king Agamemnon had insulted Apollo's priest Chryses by refusing to return the priest's daughter, whom Agamemnon had taken as a captive. Chryses prayed to Apollo. Apollo, hearing the prayer, descended from Olympus with his bow on his shoulder. The arrows in his quiver rattled with the sound of distant thunder. He came down through the night and stood near the Greek camp. He drew his bow. He loosed arrow after arrow. The mules and dogs of the Greek army died first, then the men. A plague swept through the camp. This is the dark side of Apollo, the god of healing in his other aspect, the god whose arrows could bring sickness as well as health. The Greeks understood that the same god who could cure could also harm, that the same arts that healed could also destroy. The plague at Troy, in the opening of the Iliad, lasted for 9 days. On the 10th day, the Greek seer Calchas advised Agamemnon that the only cure was to return the daughter of Chryses and to make amends to Apollo. Agamemnon reluctantly agreed. The plague lifted, but the long anger that the dispute had stirred in the Greek camp, particularly between Agamemnon and Achilles, became the central theme of the Iliad itself. There was another dark moment for Apollo, one we should mention only briefly. The story of Niobe is the story of a mortal queen who boasted that she was greater than Leto, because Niobe had 14 children and Leto had only 2. Apollo and Artemis, hearing this insult to their mother, descended to Thebes and killed all of Niobe's children. Apollo killed the 7 sons. Artemis killed the 7 daughters. Niobe, in her grief, wept until she was turned to stone, a stone in the mountains of Lydia, from which water continued to flow as if her tears had not stopped. This is a hard story, and the old singers told it with restraint. We will not press it. We will only carry from it the understanding that Apollo could be terrible when his mother was insulted, when the dignity of his family was offended, when the bright god had been pushed beyond his patience. The Greeks were honest about their gods. They did not pretend that the bright ones were always gentle. They knew that brightness, when it turns toward punishment, can be more terrible than the gloom of the underworld itself. There was also the story of Marsyas, the satyr who challenged Apollo to a musical contest. Marsyas played the flute, a wind instrument that he'd picked up after Athena, who had invented it, had discarded it in frustration because playing it made her cheeks puff out. Marsyas became a master of the flute. He boasted that his music was finer than Apollo's. The challenge was accepted. The muses themselves were the judges. The contest was close at first. Then Apollo, in some traditions, played the lyre while singing, which Marsyas could not do with the flute. The muses awarded the victory to Apollo. The penalty for Marsyas's hubris, the old story says, was harsh. We will not press it. We will only mark that Apollo, like Athena with Arachne, was not gentle with those who claimed to surpass him at his own art. The Greek myths often return to this theme, the danger of comparing oneself to a god. For now, remember this. Apollo, in the center of his many domains, was the god of measured truth. The light of his oracle was clarifying but not always comforting. The music of his lyre was harmonious but could become piercing. The arrows of his bow could heal or could bring plague. The Greeks understood that the bright god was not simply benevolent, he was, more truly, exact. He gave what each situation required, whether that was healing or harm, music or silence, prophecy or laurel. This is part of why he was loved and also why he was feared. The Greeks did not want only a kind god, they wanted a true one. Apollo was that god. He told the truth, even when the truth hurt. He played the music that the situation required, even when the music was a lament. He shot the arrow that was needed, even when the arrow brought down a beloved companion. He was, in his deepest aspect, the god of what is rather than the god of what we wish. The Pythagorean philosophers in later centuries took up Apollo as their particular patron. They taught that the universe was structured by mathematical proportions, that the planets in their orbits made a music that mortal ears could not quite hear, but that was nonetheless real. They called this music the music of the spheres. Apollo, for them, was the god who presided over this hidden music, the mathematician of the cosmos, the harmonist of the planets. To live well in the Pythagorean view was to bring one's own soul into harmony with the music of the spheres, to live in proportion, to live in measure, to live as a single note in the larger song that Apollo led. The Stoics, later still, would take up similar ideas. They saw Apollo as the figure of the rational principle, the logos, the deep order by which things were what they were. To know Apollo, in this philosophical view, was to know the rational structure of reality. The oracle at Delphi was, for them, less a chamber where particular questions were answered and more a symbol of the larger truth that reality itself had a shape that careful attention could find. To consult Apollo was to take up the long human practice of paying attention. But that is a story for another day, the way philosophy slowly took up the figures of myth and turned them gently. Tonight, we will only mark it. We will only note that Apollo, in the centuries after the bright stories of his deeds, became also a figure of contemplation. He was the god of the order beneath the appearance. He was the god of the deep music that hummed under every visible event. To listen for him was to listen for the structure of things. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi was one of the great religious centers of the ancient world. It stood on the steep slope of Parnassus, accessible only by a winding stone road. Pilgrims approached on foot. The temple was modest in size compared to some others, but its setting was unmatched. Behind it, the cliffs of Parnassus rose in pale walls. In front of it, the long valley of the Pleistos stream stretched away toward the Gulf of Corinth, visible far below in the distance. The temple sat in this dramatic landscape with the calm dignity of a place that knew it did not need to compete with the mountains around it. It belonged to its setting. Its setting belonged to it. Inside the temple stood the omphalos, the navel stone, marking the center of the world. The Greeks believed that Zeus had once released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the world to find its center, and that they had met at Delphi, marking the place with the stone. Around the omphalos in the inner chamber were various sacred objects, tripods given by victorious cities, golden offerings, statues of past Pythias, inscriptions of famous prophecies. The chamber was small and dim. The smell of the laurel that the Pythia chewed mingled with the smell of burning offerings, and with the slight strangeness of the vapor rising from the chasm beneath the floor. Pilgrims brought into this chamber would put their question often through a priest who served as intermediary. The Pythia, on her tripod, would speak. The priest would write down what she said or remember it, and would later deliver a formal verse interpretation to the pilgrim outside. The whole process might take an hour or several hours. The pilgrim would then have their answer in the form of a riddle to take home and meditate on, perhaps for years. The famous maxims inscribed at the entrance to the Delphic temple summarized something of Apollo's larger teaching. Know yourself. Nothing in excess. These 2 phrases, simple as they are, contained a great deal of the old Greek wisdom about how to live. To know yourself was the harder of the 2. It meant the long, slow work of examining your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own habits, your own assumptions, so that the truth about you was not hidden from you. Nothing in excess was, in some sense, the application of self-knowledge. Once you knew yourself, you would know also your own limits, and you would not push beyond them. Together, these 2 phrases, the Apolline maxims, became one of the great inheritances of Greek philosophy. Socrates would later take up the first maxim as the foundation of his entire teaching. Know yourself. The unexamined life is not worth living. The philosophy of self-examination that runs through so much of Western thought has its roots in the small inscription above the door of Apollo's temple at Delphi. It simply was, in the old Greek imagination, that Apollo was the god of the examined life. The light of his oracle was the light of self-knowledge. The arrows of his bow were the arrows that struck through illusion. The lyre of his music was the lyre that tuned the soul to its right shape. To honor Apollo was to take up the long practice of clarity, of measure, of the willingness to know what was true, even when knowing was not easy. There is something restful in this thought, even for a sleep story. The bright god of clarity is not asking at this hour that you examine yourself. The hour for that work is the day. The hour for sleep is the hour of letting the examination set itself aside. But it is good to know, lying in the dark, that the examined life is what the bright God honors. The day will come. The questions will return. The work of self-knowing will resume. For now, you may simply rest. The Greeks who carved the temples of Apollo did so with a particular kind of care. The marble was selected from the best quarries, Pentelic marble for the Athenian temples, Parian marble from the island of Paros for many of the great statues. The marble was transported, often across great distances by ship and ox cart, to the building site. The blocks were dressed by stonecutters using bronze chisels and wooden mallets. The columns were carved in segments called drums, each drum perfectly fitted to the next so that the seam between them was almost invisible. The fluting was cut down the length of each column with patient strokes. The capitals at the top were carved in the Doric or Ionic or Corinthian style, depending on the order chosen for the temple. The roof beams were laid. The pediments at the gable ends were filled with sculpted figures. This long, careful work could take a generation or more. The builders who began the temple often did not live to see it completed. Their sons and grandsons continued the work. The patience of stone, the patience of craft, the patience of cities that thought across generations, all of these were honored by the temple. Apollo, the patron of patience and clarity, was honored most clearly by buildings that took 50 or 100 years to complete, and that were built to stand for many thousands of years more. Inside many of Apollo's temples stood a kouros, a statue of a young man in a pose of upright attention, with the left foot slightly forward, the arms at the sides, the gaze level and calm. The kouros was, in the early archaic period of Greek art, the standard image of a young god or hero, and Apollo was often represented in this form. The kouros statues had a particular Apollonian dignity. They did not gesture, they did not pose dramatically. They stood simply with the calm attention of someone who had nothing to prove. Later, in the classical period, sculptors made more naturalistic statues of Apollo, but the older kouros figures continued to be honored in the temples that had received them as dedications from earlier centuries. The most famous of these later Apollo statues was the Apollo Belvedere, a Roman copy of a lost Greek bronze. The Apollo Belvedere shows the god standing, his weight on one leg, his bow lowered, his gaze directed across a distance. He has just shot an arrow, perhaps the arrow that killed Python. He is calm, he is in motion, but not in haste. His face is youthful, but firm. The statue, rediscovered during the Renaissance, became one of the great icons of European art, influencing painters and sculptors for centuries. Whatever the limits of the Renaissance interpretation of Apollo, the statue itself preserves something of the older Greek Apolline calm. The god who acts, but is not agitated, who sees clearly without becoming anxious about what he sees. Apollo's relationship with his sister Artemis was one of the warmest in the old mythology. The twins, born together on Delos, remained close throughout their immortal lives. They were often shown together in art, Apollo with his lyre, Artemis with her bow, the bright bowman and the silver huntress side by side. They shared their mother Leto's defense. They worked together when their family's dignity was at stake. They were also, in a deeper sense, the two halves of a single divine principle, Apollo, the bright, civilizing principle of the city and the temple, Artemis, the wild, preserving principle of the forest and the spring. Together they covered the full range of the natural and human world, the cultivated and the uncultivated, the civic and the wild. The Greeks were honest about the differences between the twins as well. Apollo's domain was largely social, oracles, music, healing in cities, the well-tuned civic life. Artemis's domain was largely solitary, the hunt, the wild places, the protection of solitary travelers. Apollo loved the bright noon of the public square. Artemis loved the dim pre-dawn of the forest path. Apollo's temples stood at the centers of cities. Artemis's temples often stood at the edges, at the borders between the cultivated land and the wild. Together, they framed the Greek world from the center to the edges. In moments of crisis, the twins acted together. When their mother Leto was insulted, they came together to defend her. When their priests were threatened, they came together to retaliate. The Niobe's story, where the twins killed all of Niobe's children, was one such moment of joint action. The story is not pleasant to dwell on, but it shows the twins functioning as a single unit when family honor was at stake. For now, remember this, that the bright god lived in a household of relations. He had a mother who had wandered to give him birth. He had a sister who had served as his midwife. He had a father who had elevated him among the new gods. He had a half-brother who had given him his lyre. He had a son whom he had grieved when Zeus had struck him down. He had loves whom he had lost, Daphne, Hyacinthus, Cyparissus, Coronis. He had servants and worshippers in every city of the Greek world. He was not an isolated figure. He was a god embedded in a web of relations, and the web included grief as well as joy, exile as well as triumph, and the slow weather of long affections that does not always result in tidy endings. The Greek calendar, in many places, gave Apollo particular months. In Athens, the month of Thargelion in late spring was sacred to him, with a festival called the Thargelia, held in his honor. The festival involved processions, offerings of the first fruits of the harvest, and certain purification rituals that cleansed the city of any accumulated pollution from the previous year. In Sparta, the festival of the Carnia was held in honor of Apollo Carnios, the patron of the Spartan army. In Boeotia, the festival of the Daphne honored Apollo with a procession in which young women carried laurel branches through the streets of Thebes. Each city had its own particular Apollo, its own particular festival, its own particular relationship with the bright god. This local diversity was one of the strengths of Greek religion. The Greeks did not insist on a single uniform worship. They allowed each city to find its own way to honor the same gods. The Apollo of Sparta was a slightly different figure from the Apollo of Athens, who was a slightly different figure from the Apollo of Delphi. All were the same god, but each city had emphasized certain aspects more than others, and the rituals reflected those emphases. To travel from city to city in the ancient Greek world was to discover the same gods over and over in slightly different forms, the way one discovers the same friends in slightly different moods at different gatherings. There were also the great Pythian games, held at Delphi every 4 years in honor of Apollo. These games were one of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic festivals of ancient Greece, alongside the Olympic Games at Olympia, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, and the Nemean Games at Nemea. The Pythian Games included athletic contests as well as musical and poetic competitions, in keeping with Apollo's dual patronage of physical prowess and artistic skill. Victors received crowns of laurel, the sacred plant of Apollo, cut from the trees of the valley of Tempe, where the god himself had performed his original purification. The athletes who competed at the Pythian Games trained for years to be ready. They came from every city of the Greek world. They competed in foot races, in wrestling, in the throwing of the discus and the javelin, in chariot racing, in boxing, in the long pentathlon that combined 5 different events. They competed also in music, in singing to the lyre, in playing the lyre alone, in playing the flute. The variety of contests reflected the variety of Apollo's domains. The same god who honored the swift runner also honored the careful singer. The same god who watched the discus arc also watched the lyre's strings vibrate. Apollo's bow is worth pausing over as a sacred object. The bow was the long-range weapon of the ancient world, the weapon of distance, of careful aim, of patience. Unlike the spear or the sword, the bow did not require the archer to come close to the target. The archer drew the bowstring, held it taut for a long, careful moment, then released. The arrow flew through the air on its own, finding the target if the aim had been true. The Greeks saw in this a kind of metaphor for many of Apollo's domains. Prophecy, like archery, was a matter of careful aim across distance. The seer drew on his attention as the archer drew on his bowstring, and the truth flew across the distance between question and answer. Healing too was a matter of distance. The doctor sent his cures into a body he could not directly enter, hoping that they would find the illness and undo it. Music was a matter of distance. The sound of the lyre travelled across the air to the ear of the listener, who received it without quite knowing how the vibration had become meaning. The Greek archers of the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age had been particularly devoted to Apollo. Their patron was the god of the long shot, the god whose own arrows could travel from Olympus to mortal targets, the god whose aim was never quite wrong. Cretan archers, particularly, had a reputation in the ancient world as being the most skilled with the bow, and their training included long prayers to Apollo. The bowmen of Pylos and Mycenae carved small images of Apollo into the wood of their bows, hoping that the touch of the god would carry through to the wood, and from the wood to the arrow. The arrows of Apollo themselves in the old imagery had a particular character. They were silver-tipped. They were said to make a faint silver whistle in flight, audible only to those with refined hearing. They struck swiftly and decisively. The Greeks who died of sudden illness were sometimes said to have been struck by Apollo's arrows. The Greeks who died of slow illness were not. Sudden death, in the old imagination, had a kind of dignity that slow wasting did not. To be struck by Apollo's arrow was to die quickly, without prolonged suffering, in the bright air. It was, in some sense, a merciful end among the various ends available. His sister Artemis carried similar arrows, though hers were associated more with the deaths of women than of men. Together, the twin bows of Apollo and Artemis were the long-range mercy and justice of the cosmos. Where they fell, the old Greeks said, they fell decisively. There was no slow suffering, no lingering. The arrows were swift. The arrows were sure. The arrows were the mark of the bright twins. Beyond Delphi and Delos, there were many other oracles in the ancient world that were not directly Apollo's, but that were related to him in various ways. There was the oracle of Trophonius at Lebedaia in Boeotia, a dark cave oracle that involved descending into the earth. There was the oracle of Zeus at Dodona with its rustling oak. There was the Oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian desert. There were the various Sibyls, prophetic women associated with Apollo who spoke from caves and cliffsides across the Mediterranean. The most famous Sibyl was at Cumae in Italy, near what is now Naples, where the Cumaean Sibyl uttered her prophecies from a cave with 100 mouths. The Romans considered her one of the great oracles of the world. Her prophecies, written on palm leaves and gathered into books, were preserved in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome for centuries. Apollo was, in many of these traditions, the god behind the various forms of oracular speech. Where the Pythia at Delphi was his most famous voice, the other prophets and prophetesses were also, in some sense, channels for his clarity. To consult an oracle anywhere in the ancient world was to come into Apollo's general territory. To listen for the answer was to listen for him. There were also smaller forms of his attention that the Greeks recognized. The flight of birds was, in many traditions, a form of divine speech, and Apollo was the god most often invoked when augurs read the patterns of bird flight. A flight of eagles to the right was a good sign. A flight of crows to the left was a bad sign. The crow was, in some traditions, one of Apollo's birds, but a dark grey one, the bird of bad news. The white raven, once Apollo's sacred bird, had been turned dark by the god himself when it brought him the news of Coronis's unfaithfulness. The raven's blackness in the old imagination was the colour of bad news, permanently affixed to the messenger. The swan was Apollo's brighter bird, the bird of music, of song, of beauty. Swans were said to sing most beautifully just before their deaths, and this image, the swan song, became one of the great Greek metaphors for the artist whose finest work comes at the end of life. Apollo was the god of this final song. He honoured those who, knowing they were near the end of their long work, found new clarity and new beauty in their last efforts. The dolphin was another of Apollo's animals, particularly in his role as the god who had come to Delphi by sea. One of his names was Apollo Delphinios, Apollo of the dolphin. The old story said that Apollo had once transformed himself into a dolphin to lead a Cretan ship across the Mediterranean to the harbour below Delphi, where the sailors of the ship became the first priests of his oracle. The dolphin in this tradition was the mediator between sea and land, between the ordinary world and the sacred precinct, between the daily voyage and the moment of arriving at the temple. These small animals, the swan and the dolphin and the raven, gave Apollo's mythology a presence in the natural world. The Greek, who saw a swan flying overhead or a dolphin leaping beside a ship or a raven cawing from a high branch, was reminded of his god. The presence of the bright Lord of Clarities was not confined to the temple at Delphi. It was scattered across the landscape, into the flight of birds and the movement of sea creatures and the sound of distant music carried on the wind. In Roman times, after the conquest of Greece, Apollo continued to be worshipped under his Greek name. The Romans did not always rename the Greek gods. With Apollo, they kept the name. He was Apollo for both peoples. The Emperor Augustus claimed Apollo as his particular patron, building a great temple to him on the Palatine Hill in Rome. The Augustan Apollo was associated with the new peace of the empire, with the order brought by Augustus after the long civil wars of the late Republic. Apollo, for Augustus, was the god of imperial measure, of the bright stability that the new emperor wanted to embody. The temple on the Palatine was decorated with images of Apollo's victories over Python and over the Niobids, the symbols of the bright order subduing the older chaos. This Augustan use of Apollo shaped the later European imagination of the bright god in ways that were not always faithful to the older Greek tradition. The Roman Apollo became increasingly the god of empire, the god of order in the imperial sense. The Greek Apollo had been a more troubled figure with his sorrows and his griefs and his sudden anger. The Roman Apollo was smoother, more dignified, more useful as a state god. The later Renaissance and Enlightenment versions of Apollo in European painting and poetry drew more from the Roman Apollo than from the Greek. Apollo became, in those later traditions, the god of pure light, of reason, of artistic perfection, with the shadows somewhat erased. The older Greek Apollo, with his griefs and his exiles and his uncomfortable truths, is the one we have been telling tonight. He is the more interesting god, perhaps, because he is the less simplified one. He loves and loses. He acts and regrets. He kills and is exiled. He returns from exile cleansed, but marked. He gives prophecies that wound the questioner. He is, in his full Greek shape, both the bright god of clarity and the god who has known the cost of clarity. The brighter you see, the harder some sights become to bear. Apollo had seen everything and had not always been able to look away. The night is older now, and the story has carried us far. Let us gather the figures and let them settle. Leto, wandering from place to place. Delos, the small wandering island, agreeing to receive her. The palm tree, the pool, the labor of 9 days. Eileithyia, slipping away from Hera with her amber necklace. Artemis as her brother's first midwife. Apollo, born under circling swans, growing rapidly into a young god with bow and lyre. Python, the great serpent at the navel of the world, falling to Apollo's arrows. The exile to Tempe, the laurel cut from the river trees, the slow purification. The return to Delphi, the founding of the great oracle. The Pythia on her tripod, breathing the vapor. The omphalos in the inner chamber. Daphne, transforming into the laurel rather than be taken. Hyacinthus falling in the play of the discus. Cyparissus becoming the cypress in his unending grief. Asclepius, the great healer, struck down by Zeus. The Cyclopes killed in retaliation. The year of exile as a shepherd to Admetus. The Hyperboreans in their northern country. The plague at Troy. The arrows falling among the Greek army. The children of Niobe, all dead in a single morning. The muses around their leader, singing. The maxims at the door of the temple. The Pythagorean music of the spheres. The slow inheritance of the examined life into all later philosophy. The great Pythian games every 4 years, athletes and musicians coming from every city to compete for the laurel crown. These are the figures of Apollo's mythology, and you do not have to hold them. They are mentioned only so that they may settle. Let the names drift down like petals into water. Let the images soften. Let the long history of the bright god become a quiet weight in the room. The way a high lamp is a quiet weight, holding without insisting. There is one more small image worth carrying tonight from the older Greek tradition of Apollo. It is the image of him among ordinary mortals, walking through a market, perhaps, or sitting by a well in a small village in the hills. He has come down from Olympus, the old stories say, in disguise to see how mortals live. He carries a small lyre under his arm. He plays a few notes when he is asked. He listens to the talk of the women at the well. He watches the children running between the houses. He does not announce himself. He is just one more traveller passing through. But where he has passed, the village seems calmer afterward. The disputes that had been festering soften a little. The illnesses that had been worrying the elders ease. The young people find new ideas for their work. The bright god has been there. He has done his quiet work. He has moved on. The village does not know what has happened, but it knows that something has shifted, and that the shift was good. Now let the story loosen, the way every long telling must when sleep approaches. Let the cliffs of Parnassus fade into a pale wall against a darker sky. Let the omphalos rest in its dim chamber, the laurel branches above it folding their leaves for the night. Let the Pythia descend from her tripod, the vapour growing thinner as the chasm cools. Let the laurel groves on every hillside settle into stillness. Let the hyacinth and the cypress, the small living memorials, hold their colours quietly through the dark. Let Delos, the small island, rest beneath the stars, with its palm tree and its small pool unwatched. Let the muses lower their voices. Let the lyre rest on its hook beside the throne of the god. Let the bow be set down for the night. Good evening and welcome back, one last time, to the slow, gentle work of letting the story rest. The night has carried Apollo a long way, from a small wandering island to a great oracle on a mountainside to a long history of philosophical inheritance. There are many other tellings of him, many other moments, many other lovers and friends and enemies and worshippers, but that is a story for another day. The grove of his mythology is wide enough that no single knight can walk all its paths. There is a final image of Apollo that the old Greek tradition liked to leave with its listeners. It is the image of the god at the end of a long day at Delphi, when the last pilgrim has descended the winding path, when the priests have closed the inner doors of the temple, when the Pythia has gone to her own quarters to rest. The sun is setting over the long valley of the Pleistos. The mountains across the valley have begun to glow in the late light. The cliffs of Parnassus behind the temple have turned the colour of old rose. The laurel trees in the small grove beside the spring of Castalia are dark against the brightening sky, and Apollo stands, perhaps on the roof of his own temple, looking out over the long valley of his sanctuary. He is not impatient. He is not eager. He is simply where he belongs. The old singers like to imagine him at this moment as the still centre of the bright day, the patient figure who had been there since dawn and would be there until dawn again. The pilgrims had come. The pilgrims had gone. Their questions had been answered in whatever form the oracle had spoken them. Their lives would continue, shaped by what they had heard. The god remained. The next day would bring more pilgrims. The next day would bring more questions. The same patient, bright god would receive them. The cycle would continue year after year, century after century, while the empires rose and fell below the mountain, and the cities of Greece reshaped themselves in their various ways. Apollo would be there. The oracle would be there. The bright god of clarities would continue to give his careful answers to those who climbed the long path to find him. For now, remember this. Tonight, the work of the tale is done. It simply was, like all old stories, the carrying of the bright, clarifying god through the long inheritance of nights. Let the names settle. Let the rooms settle. Let the night gather you up. Imagine the great oracle at Delphi far behind you, the bronze tripod and the vapour and the long stone road of pilgrims no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the temple on the slope. feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the omphalos, the laurel, the lyre, the bow, the maxims, and the long, patient, bright presence of the god in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.